Let's go.
You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
We're back again on Making Data Simple. I appreciate everybody listening, of course. And as always, I'm going to jump right in because I have the guest today, Dr. Sean Falconer. He hosts a podcast himself, which I hopefully we'll get an opportunity to talk about. He's a couple of different podcasts, in my understanding, but he's held leadership positions across multiple functions: product, engineering, developer relations, and marketing. He is responsible, at least in some form, we'll get to this, for AI at Confluent. He's an engineer and storyteller. He is a Snowflake data superhero, an AWS community builder. I was on his Medium blog today. Very good, by the way. It's going to be a new staple for me. I think the last one you posted was in March, and I was looking at that. We'll have to hit on that a bit too. And 100% Canadian. So look, are you just ticked off at the tariff? So you got to make sure you put that 100%? I'm not sure. What do you think, Sean?
I've lived in the United States now for 15 years, but I feel still, despite that, and having married an American and having children that were born here, I still feel, a very deep connection to my homeland, I guess. So I like to make people know that, yes, I live in the U.S. I fell in love with an American. I enjoy being here. It's been fantastic for myself and my career, but I still very much, my homeland is Canada.
Where at in Canada?
I grew up in New Brunswick, which is, for those that are, very few people know where New Brunswick is. I'm always shocked when people say, oh yeah, I know where that is. And I'm not talking about New Brunswick, New Jersey, New Brunswick, Canada, which is a small province. It's mostly trees. It's like 99% trees north of Maine, essentially. So I grew up on the border of Maine. You can walk to Maine in like 5 minutes from my parents' house.
Nice. But how do you know you're 100%? Not really. Have you done 23andMe? You may be like 90, 95. I'm not sure you're 100%, man.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how you're defining that, but it's fair enough. Like most people that live in North America, probably if you go back far enough, we're not originally from here. They're European transplants in some fashion, which is the case with myself.
Terrific. I will let you introduce yourself, but I also want to make mention of, you got two podcasts, right? It's like one is the Software Huddle and the other one is Software Engineering Daily. Could you tell me a little bit about those as well? I mean, like, I know you're doing well. When my team had you coming on, they warned me like 3 times and said, oh, this guy's the real deal. This is a real deal. So first of all, I guess first question is, are you the real deal? And then secondly, give me some information on your podcast.
Well, to answer your first question, I would never refer to myself as the real deal. So probably not. And then in terms of the podcast, so Software Engineering Daily is a podcast that's been around for a long time. I can't remember the exact starting point for it, but it was started by a man named Jeff Meyerson. And he grew it to be, he was his full-time job. He did a podcast every single day, 5 days a week, essentially. That's why it was Software Engineering Daily. Grew it to a massive audience of 250, 300 million downloads or 300,000 downloads a month or so. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. And at that point, I had already started to be involved in the show. I was a guest at one point. I started writing for them a little bit. And his family took over the show, and his brothers are both engineers as well. And they reached out to me to see what if I knew anybody that would be interested in essentially hosting the show. And I said, well, what about me? So they said, okay, we didn't think you'd do it, but that sounds good. So then I started hosting those as a guest host, and they had a whole bunch of people sort of guest hosting. And then over time, what we ended up doing was they ended up sort of, pruning the number of people that were guest hosting, keeping people who were more serious about it. And then I became one of their forever hosts, where I host an episode every week. Every Tuesday is one of my episodes. And I've been doing that for the last couple of years. And then while this was going on, I also started a second podcast that I started myself that I own called Software Huddle with my friend Alex Debris. And Alex is an expert in databases. And then I have, AI background, data infrastructure background as well. And we wanted to kind of carve out our own thing that we could have sort of full control over from a creative standpoint and do some experimentation with and things like that. And that's how that started.
And I hear you're doing pretty good. They told me that, hey, Al, your podcast is nice, but Sean's got the real deal here. He's got a ton of people joining his podcast. Something like, what is it, 50,000 downloads a month? Something like that?
For Huddle, yeah, it's approximately in that ballpark, yeah.
The Software
Engineering Daily does about, I think, around a quarter million a month.
Wow, that's fantastic. And they still do it daily?
Yes, although I just do the Tuesday shows. So then there's a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday full-time hosts, and then there's sort of satellite episodes that come in on Mondays and Fridays.
Look, doing it daily, I have enough trying to do it once a week. Do you do yours once a week?
Yeah, I do it once a week.
All right. Hey, if you wouldn't mind, Sean, please introduce yourself if you would, and don't leave any of the meat out. Let us know who you are and how you got here, and a little bit of your history.
Sounds good. So I am Sean Falconer, and I'm Confluent's AI entrepreneur in residence. So I lead our AI product and product strategy and work on kind of all things AI across the organization. really trying to drive innovation from the go-to-market side to also the R&D side of the business. And then my background, I've worked in data and AI for essentially the bulk of my career. I spent the time I was 17 to almost 30 in university studying these different topics across 3 different degrees in computer science. I thought that I wanted to be an academic or a researcher. But then when I was doing my postdoc, which was why I originally moved to the US, I started a startup on the side with 2 other students. And then after we raised money, I ended up leaving the world of academics to do that full time as the CTO and co-founder of that company. Ran it for 7 years. And then we ended up eventually selling it. It was a great experience. I'm not living on a yacht or anything like that. It wasn't that kind of sale.
What happened? Why aren't you living on a yacht? How do I know that? The room looks kind of nice. Maybe it is a yacht. So what happened there? Was it a good exit or what?
Not from a financial perspective, I would say. It looks good on paper, I guess. You run a company, you raise $5 million, run a company for 7 years, have an exit. Like, that's all great, but it wasn't necessarily a financial windfall for us or anything like that.
Would you do it again?
That's a good question. I think so under the right circumstances. I am in a different place in my life now. I have 2 small children that I have to feed. It's a little bit different than being a student who never made any money in his entire life and was used to living on top ramen and
of course, it's kind of fun though. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit different now. I have different sort of financial requirements, I guess, placed on myself. But I did really, really enjoy the experience of having to wear a lot of hats, and you just have to figure out stuff. There's nobody else to figure this stuff out. Like, the buck stops with you. And I think that as somebody who had spent a lot of time studying engineering and was the CTO of the company, it really forced me out of my comfort zone, because I had to go and go on sales calls. I had to pitch VCs. I had to learn marketing and all these parts of a business that I had no idea about, just because if I didn't do them and I wasn't involved with them, there was nobody else to do those things. So I don't think I would be in the place that I am today in a job that I really love, doing, again, wearing so many hats, but in a large organization, if I hadn't had that experience as a founder.
Yeah, it makes sense. Hey, I didn't mean to interrupt your momentum here. Go ahead and continue your story here. But you started the company, you sold, you exited, and I presume Google's in the path here someplace as well?
Yeah, so after 7 years, I wanted to move on to other things. So I stepped back from the business, took on an advisory role for a year while my co-founder continued to run it, and then we sold it about a year after I left. And during that time, I went and joined Google, where I had actually a really unique experience there, where I was able to join a new product area at Google. So it had some of that element of being a founder, because you're kind of going in and jumping in and trying to figure out things from scratch. But you're doing it within a massive organization with like 100,000 full-time employees. So I worked there for 4 years, primarily focused on some of their conversational AI products and their business communication products. And I worked on a lot of their developer experience, both from a product perspective as well as in developer relations. And then after Google, at the end of 4 years, I was kind of getting the itch to go back to startups and do something a little bit more fast-paced, a little bit more like you're building the airplane while you're flying it at the same time. So I joined a Series B startup called Skyflow, just focused on data privacy and security. It was a data privacy security infrastructure company. And we ended up doing a lot of interesting things in relation to AI, because generative AI really blew up while I was there. And there was a lot of privacy security concerns, and our product was had a really compelling offer to help provide certain privacy controls around training models or fine-tuning models and so forth. And then after 3 years at Skyflow, I decided I wanted to move into a more technical sort of product-facing role, and ended up joining Confluent about 7 months ago to do that.
Wow, so that brings you to today, right? Mm-hmm. So what's your brand? If you had to narrow down your brand, because you've been like an entrepreneur, clearly you're a writer, you even say you're a storyteller, AI, infrastructure, I think data movement. How would you label yourself?
That's tough. I think the reason I've ended up being sort of a million miles wide and an inch deep in a lot of areas is because I've always made my career decisions based on where I thought I could push myself to continue to get better. Like, what are the educational opportunities for me? And that's ended up forcing, aligning me into different roles, because I really thrive on problem solving. Skyflow ended up running the entire marketing department, not because I ever had any desire of being a CMO, but because there was a gap there and they needed someone to come in and solve some problems. So I think that's really what I thrive on, is the problem solving aspect. I like kind of being thrown into ambiguous, complex areas and just trying to figure it out. I got that as an academic, I got that as a founder, and now I'm really getting that at Confluent once again.
So what is the biggest opportunity of learning today then, if that's where you channel your career?
There's never been a time in my career, certainly, where technology was moving faster. There's so much happening in the data and AI space right now. It's impossible to keep up with, even if it's your job. So I think there's just infinitely many things to learn right now. And I think the amazing thing too about technology at this point is there's unlimited number of opportunities to go and source different information. If you want to learn something, it's not like when I was in high school or even, before high school, sort of pre-internet, where you had to go to a library and try to find stuff, or even the early days of the internet, you're going and searching for these. It's like, there's so many places you can go and find material. Now that causes other problems where you can have so much stuff that it becomes overwhelming. And it's hard sometimes to tell what is a good source versus a bad source. But there's just such a amazing number of sources out there and experts in the industry that you can constantly be learning from. I also think generative AI technology has also changed the way that we learn. It's certainly changed the way that I consume information. Now, if I want to read something like an academic paper, back when I was an academic researcher, I would read the title and abstract and figure out, do I want to read this, spend time on it? And then we read it cover to cover, spend a lot of time thinking about it and diving into the details and figuring out, like, what is novel about this? How can I use this for my own work, or what's the relationship to it? Now I can take something like that and throw it into a ChatGPT or Gemini or one of these software tools and just start asking questions. The generative AI technology has given us a way to create highly custom, personalized educational experiences, which is far different than anything we've experienced historically, because most education has been designed essentially for one particular learning style just because of scalability challenges. But now AI has created essentially the technology that we can create these like highly custom, highly personalized experiences to consume information.
I've got to ask this question, then I'll move on to Confluent and your role there, and then we'll obviously probably dive into AI because we can't escape it. But how do you learn? I mean, what does a day for Sean Falconer look like?
So I spend, I think, a decent amount of my time reading mostly stuff online, I would say, either papers on archives sometimes that relate to my work or maybe are interesting, reading about other companies that are doing things innovative in the space or maybe related to Confluent. And with each of those, I'm reading and thinking about how does this relate to what our goals and strategies are, what our customers want, and how does it fit into overall our strategy and our product vision, as well as just general interest. But a lot of times it's just consuming and reading that information and thinking about it deeply.
Outside of your podcast, are there other podcasts, or are there news articles? Are there blogs that you're big fans of?
So I read a lot of stuff on Medium, as well as Newsstack are good places to look for articles. And I do, like, podcasts are probably the number one way I can tend to learn and consume information. So if there's a topic that catches my eye, then my immediate instinct is almost always to go and search for a podcast that's related to that topic. Or if there's a company or founder or some sort of technology that I want to learn about, then a podcast is usually the first stop for me, because it's a way that I can be doing the dishes while also passively learning about something.
Makes sense. All right. So look, you are the AI entrepreneur in residence at Confluent. You got to tell me what that means.
I think it probably means different things to different people, but it really is owning AI strategy and thought leadership at the company. And I think a big part of it is thinking. So I sit within the technology strategy group at the company, and really that entire group sits kind of in the intersection between product and go-to-market. And they're looking at, based on their expertise, where is technology going in that space? What will customers potentially need, and how do we need to evolve as a company, either on the go-to-market or product side, to meet those needs, meet those demands? And the area that I really own, of course, is around AI. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about how do we need to evolve as a company to serve our customer needs and where the market is going. So it's really looking beyond even the roadmap of where we are today. We might have a roadmap carved out for the next 12 months, but where do we need to be in 2 or 3 years from now?
So if you were sitting in front of the board right now, you haven't talked to them before, you got like 2 minutes to capture their attention. I don't know if this is a fair question, but I'm sure you're going to do it well. Where is the market going? What do they need to be thinking first?
How much time do I have?
Well, you can take some. I said 2 minutes, but we'll give some latitude here. It's fine, whatever, because I'm interested in what your answer is, no matter how long it takes.
Yeah. So right now, of course, the industry is all focused on AI agents. But even if something else comes along related to generative AI, I think that's the world we're going to be living in certainly for the foreseeable future is AI agents. But even if something else comes along, I think when we're talking about building on foundation models, the key thing there is I think they have really unique data requirements that are different than probably, certainly from an ML perspective, anything that we've seen before historically. So with things like predictive models or purpose-built models, we were taking very domain-specific, application-specific data and then training a very domain-specific, application-specific model. So in a lot of ways, we were baking the representation of our business and our particular problems into the weights of that model. They were not very flexible, but they really effective at solving a particular problem. And the challenge there is I can't repurpose them. I can't pick up my fraud detection model and start doing image classification with it. And with foundation models, they kind of have the opposite problem, where they're very general purpose. They're trained on massive amounts of information. and they can do infinitely many things, but they're really dumb about your business. They weren't trained on that particular information. So the big challenge for businesses is essentially that in order to get business specific value out of those models, they need to be able to feed that in during prompt time assembly to provide the right context to drive a result that's actually going to be meaningful for that business. And providing that right context at the right time involves essentially connecting into a whole bunch of different data systems. That becomes a real challenge for most businesses. And on top of that, I think that building any generative AI application, if you want it to be reliable, be able to perform reasoning capabilities similar to what maybe a human would be able to perform in that particular task, you need both essentially historical sort of static asset data that exists in a database somewhere, and you also need essentially real-time data, real-time signals, so that you know what's happening in the moment and happening in the now. And I think for the first time in our history of building software, the requirements around bringing both those real-time systems and the historical systems together is ever more a high priority requirement to essentially be able to get value out of these systems, regardless of whether you're building an AI agent or some sort of RAG-based application or something like that. It's fundamental essentially to being able to drive reliable results out of those models. You need access to both those systems. That kind of, I think, changes the way that businesses have to think about operationalizing their data and the types of data systems they're going to use. So my main thing would be the future of AI is really about the future of your data systems. Like every AI problem is fundamentally a data problem. So if your underlying data infrastructure is a complete mess, slapping a model on top of it's not going to help you. You have to solve that problem first.
Yeah, what we call it making data simple, and it's still all about the data. I grant you that. But are you saying that most systems, as we move forward, we've been preaching here at IBM a lot about purpose-built systems, using smaller purpose-built LLMs with your client data. Do you believe that as we move forward, you're going to need multiple LLMs essentially integrated together to perform a complete system, a complete solution?
So it's a good question. So the way I think about it is that even if you're using one LLM to power all these things, you're most likely going to be decomposing problems into smaller subproblems, building, essentially a multi-agent system. So you're not going to have one monolithic application that does everything. You're going to break it apart, just like we've been doing, for decades in software. We're going to break it apart into small systems, and the smaller systems are going to work together, collaborate to solve a more complex problem, just like teams of people do to solve more complex problems. And some of those systems might rely on small language models or purpose-built models, or maybe not even a model at all, whereas other ones rely on some sort of large language model or other generative a model that has billions of parameters, depending on the task that they have at hand. So I think what we end up with is in a lot of these systems is not necessarily more purpose-built models. That could be the case, but we're going to end up with more purpose-built data systems to feed the data into that particular sort of subcomponent that has one specific task to complete.
That makes sense. Look, I believe that we'll also end up in purpose-built large language models, or that are tuned. Like here at IBM, we've got a technology called InstructLab we use to change those parameters. So it's really tailored. It's not fine-tuning. It's a little bit different so that you can alter that LLM. Otherwise, I find that the larger the model, some of these, 300 billion parameter models are almost unaffordable in inferencing cost. But having said that, is that would you agree, first of all? And will that tailor itself to agentic AI? And is that where we're going?
So in terms of the cost of like the models themselves, I do think the cost of the tokens going down dramatically. Just like at one point the cost of transistors went down dramatically. That also impacted the overall industry and the number of people who could have PCs and so forth. So I think that will be a continued trend. But right now, that's certainly a concern for many companies. Is like, how much am I spending on tokens? How much is this frontier model costing me? And I think that sometimes because these models are super powerful and they can do many things, we sometimes use them inappropriately. There's a lot of things that existing models like sentiment analysis have been developed and very successful in. Like, you don't always need to go to the largest, most powerful model. A lot of times that's like using a chainsaw to cut your steak. Like, can you use a chainsaw to cut your steak? Probably, but is that the most effective, reasonable tool to use? Probably not. Right. So you have to, I think, look at it that way. But I do think that a good place to start sometimes is with the high-powered model, and then get to a place where your performance is performing at the level that you want. And then you can start to experiment with using smaller models or different types of models or open source models, or even taking an open source model and fine tuning it for the task. Because at least you have some base level thing to evaluate it against.
I do think the cost of tokens is decreasing and will continue to decrease like we've seen over history. I mean, that's just how technology evolves. However, I also think the number of tokens that we're getting involved with is dramatically increasing at the same time, particularly with agentic AI. So I think it's going to be some time before we see that inferencing cost decline to really an affordable level that everybody can just use some of these very, very large models.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, reducing the cost of tokens, but we're also increasing the size of the context window and also increasing the number of inference cycles that we're running. Because it's not necessarily like a one-shot inference now. If you're doing a model and you're using tools, then you're going to be probably doing some sort of React-based agent where you're doing multiple rounds of inference. So those are things that you have to factor into your cost model. But I do think that one of the advantages of thinking about multi-agent systems is, besides it giving you a framework with which to decompose problems into smaller subproblems, which is almost always like a good sort of architectural decision, you can constrain significantly the sort of problem set and also your input output token lengths for your agents, because they're focused on solving a particular problem. So if I am tasking an agent with potentially like hundreds of different things, not only does it become hard to test it against, but the context window gets really, really big because it doesn't know what tools it's going to have, need to use it for any particular task. So then I might need to perform a lot more rounds of inference to figure out which tools make sense for that particular task. Whereas if I've done the upfront work of, hey, I just want you to take this insurance claim and essentially evaluate the likelihood that we're going to approve it before handing it off to the next agent in the process, well, then I can significantly limit the amount of inputs and outputs and the tools available to solve that particular problem. That makes it easier to test, and it also gives me controls over how big does this input realistically need to be, and how big does the output realistically need to be.
Let me switch gears just a little bit and talk about Confluent. Mm-hmm. If you're going back to that 2-minute pitch on Confluent, where are you super excited about Confluent, what you're doing with Confluent, what differentiation you guys have in the market? What would that be?
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing really is, relates to some of the stuff that we're talking about around multi-agent systems, which I think is where the world is really going. So people are going to build singular monolithic agents. They're going to decompose these, end up with a multi-agent system. And when you strip back some of the hype around an agent and you just look at it from an architectural standpoint, how are you going to actually run these things in a production environment? Realistically, all these things are microservices with brains, where the brain is this, large language model or some other type of model. And when I think about these essentially microservices, and then when I have a multi-agent system, I have a bunch of microservices that all need to communicate with each other. Well, that's the same problem that we've been solving from 10, 15 years ago when we started breaking up monolithic applications into a system of microservices. And the way that people have been able to build really effective, high-scale, durable microservices has been through technology like Kafka to build essentially event-driven architecture, where we decouple these microservices from having explicit dependencies and point-to-point connections, but instead communicate through an event broker and get this nice decoupling between the services and the teams. And that same architectural pattern that we've been successfully doing for the better part of a decade is the same architectural pattern that we need to be using essentially to build and scale multi-agent systems. So that is the thing I think I'm most excited about, where we see the most interest and traction from customers in the industry. And I think that's really the future of building these multi-agent systems.
And where is Confluent set up for success?
So I think there's a couple different places. So you can, of course, use Confluent as the backbone of those systems. So instead of having agents necessarily communicate directly with each other, they're just producing and consuming events, which can be served over Kafka using Confluent if you want to use essentially the Confluent brand of Kafka. There's a number of reasons you might want to do that. But one of the big advantages of using something like Kafka is it's an immutable log. So I have the entire history of events that are going back and forth between these agents. I have all those messages. So that gives me a way to debug and actually understand what's going on. I also get replayability, which is really important for building these applications, where if I'm doing, I want to change a prompt to an agent, or I want to bring in a new type of agent, I want to be able to replay something that looks like real traffic without having real side effects to live traffic. And I can do that essentially using these Kafka topics that are storing the history of communication between these different agents. So that's a big part of it. And then on top of that, typically there's a lot of use cases for agents, especially when we're talking about business use cases, that require a certain amount of essentially data processing before we're going to have an agent act on that information. For example, if I want to do some sort of personalization experience, where part of that is based on how our customers are interacting with a website, then I have a bunch of click data of how they're interacting with the website. I might have other information as well. Well, I don't want to just send a fire hose of clickstream traffic to an agent and have the agent figure it out. It's a good way to have a very expensive bill at the end of the day and have a really high token cost. What I want to be able to do is some sort of stream processing on that clickstream data, or it could be IoT sensor data or some other type of feeder of information that's this long continuous stream of information that I want to do some kind of complex event processing on to figure out what is the subset of this data or the trigger with which to start this agentic experience. So you can use technology like Apache Flink That's basically what it was designed for, is to handle these long continuous stream processing, data processing capabilities across streams and across batch systems. And Apache Flink is now core to Confluent's platform as well. So we can use Flink essentially as a way to do the upstream stream processing on those events that lead to some sort of agentic experience.
So don't let me over summarize or put words in your mouth here, but is that is to say that Confluent would say, hey, Mr. Customer, we know you're putting AI into action. We know you're activating AI agents, integrating across your APIs across the business. What we'll do here at Confluent is we are the data streaming platform that will stream, connect, process, govern your data all in one place. Is that the pitch, or am I or minimizing it?
No, that's absolutely it. I mean, because in order to build these systems, essentially, you need to get access to the data. And you can do that through using our managed connectors. You need to liberate the data from these different sources so I can feed them into my models to power agents or other types of AI systems. I also need a way for the agents to communicate with each other. And I can use that using Confluent's data streaming platform. And I often need also a way to be able to perform processing upstream or downstream from an agentic workflow in order to feed input into an agent or fan out output from the agent. And essentially, I can do that using technology like our managed Flink or other stream processing capabilities.
But why would I choose Confluent over like other technologies that do data streaming?
There's no other platform that essentially is a full managed data streaming platform. I can go and use, I can get Kafka from a vendor. I could tack in some, open source Apache Flink or a managed Flink on its own. But then I'm essentially ending up with the problem where I might be having 4 different vendor systems I need to manage, or I have to manage the open source versions of these myself, which is I'm taking on a certain amount of complexity and responsibility to do that. Whereas if I go with a singular platform of Confluent, I get all of those things as one singular platform that is essentially designed to all work together. On top of that, we've also extended a lot of the existing functionality of Flink to bring AI workloads as native, first-class citizens into the world of stream processing, which I don't necessarily get from another vendor.
As the AI entrepreneur, how was that phrase? Influencer, in residence, or how are you guiding the business?
In terms of guidance to the business, I think that the future of most agents that businesses want to invest in are not essentially user-prompted agentic experiences. So most of what we see in demos today is some sort of user chatting with an agent. And I think really the types of workflows that businesses care about automating are going to be things that are embedded essentially into the infrastructure that's running, long-running, continuous, in asynchronous. So it's things that react to log data that's coming in, things that react to customer support tickets that go off and figure out how to actually solve this problem. And the result of that might be a first draft that goes to a human to essentially approve, but it's essentially these long-running asynchronous continuous jobs where a lot of times we need to take into account multiple pieces of information about a customer, about multiple streams of information. There's heterogeneous information that we need to combine. And all of that, to me, speaks essentially data streaming and stream processing. That's what these technologies were developed for, is to be able to take long-running continuous information, do complex processing on that information for things like real-time analytics and so forth. And I think agents empowering AI is a natural extension of those technologies. And if you need essentially to combine some form of data processing with agentic work, then you don't want to do that in essentially 2 different systems. Because if you're doing it in 2 different systems, then that's 2 separate systems that you need to essentially push data and pull data back and forth from. But if I can bring those technologies essentially together, then suddenly I have one system to maintain, and I get a lot of essentially the value of only having to work with one particular technology to do all this sort of complex reasoning with.
I got to ask you a tough question because I'm just curious, because you're an industry expert, I can tell. I hope that and if you don't want to answer that, we'll just cut it from the podcast. But here's the question I want to ask you. Look, you're from Confluent, I'm from IBM. I think we'd all bet on both those businesses or we wouldn't be here. But I want to put those aside for a second. This is a question I learned from Warren Buffett. And here's the question is, if you were forced to bet all your money on another company in the industry doing data streaming, let's start there, and you had to bet it all for the rest of your lifetime, in terms of that was the only returns, what company would you bet on?
So you're asking me which data streaming company that's not Confluent would I bet on?
I know you would bet on Confluent. I've already got that, right? So I'm just curious why, because I just want to see what else is out there.
I don't know that I could legitimately answer that question in a reasonable way. I mean, I think my bet would, if I'm looking at where I think things are developing in interesting ways, it's not really necessarily a financial bet, but I think the place that offers the most innovation and interest for companies outside of what Confluent is really around open source. A lot of these technologies come from the open source world. Probably the majority of people who are using them are choosing to manage them and run them themselves in some fashion today. And I think like a lot of technologies, especially when we're in innovative spaces like AI, are driven essentially by the community and the ecosystem that is developing that stuff from the ground up, building these applications. They understand the needs. And a lot of times they're able to move faster than necessarily a singular company can.
Fair answer. I know it was a tough question. I never tried that before on a podcast. So you're the first, Sean, and you did well. Maybe I'll ask it a different way because I know that's pretty hard. What would you short in concept in the data streaming industry? It doesn't have to be a company, but what technology would you short right now?
So picking a technology I don't think is going to last.
Yeah, that may be popular right now. It could be anything. It could be a company. It could be a technology. I'm just curious because then I ask why.
I mean, I think a related technology might be around ETL.
You think it's going to be dead in 5 years?
I don't know. I don't think it's going to be completely dead because there's just too many people that have like install bases and have spent a lot of money already on it and stuff like that. Like it's something that, but I don't know that it's necessarily a growing market. After 5 years would be what I would say. There's fundamentally some real challenges with ETL. I don't think anybody's particularly happy with the 10,000 ETL pipelines that they develop for their business. It doesn't lead to satisfying results. It's kind of a legacy technology where we end up driving a lot of internal dashboards off of this thing that is super brittle because there's so many point-to-point connections, and there's different ETL pipelines that essentially we have a dashboard that's dependent on multiple ETL pipelines and they're all operating at different speeds. That leads to unsatisfying outcomes for the business. And then on top of that, when we need to get data back out of our warehouse to the operational state of the business to power some sort of application, we're adding another type of ETL pipeline to reverse ETL it back out, which then essentially compounds the problem. So I just don't see how it's very hard for businesses to run those systems today in a satisfying way. And now when we're trying to build really powerful AI experiences on top of that, I just don't see these as feeders into those systems that are going to lead to like a satisfying result for businesses.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, let me ask a similar question on agentic AI. What technologies or companies would you go all in on right now? Again, not Confluent or IBM, just to see where your head's at and why.
I would say that Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, I believe in. I think that as soon as it was announced, I recognized the potential of it. And I think that over the last couple of months, we've really seen all the major industry players come out in backing it. And I think having ecosystems a lot of times are supported by the right time, right place, but also right backers really make a difference as well. So if all the major players are also supporting it, then it might get to a place where it has so much momentum that it's going to be very, very difficult to displace. So that's one sort of, it's a standard essentially, less so than a particular technology that I'm going to buy off the shelf. But I think it's something that's here to essentially last at least for the foreseeable future.
What do you think, would you bet against?
Things related to prompt engineering as a job. I think the models are getting, a lot of ways, prompting is a necessary part of interacting with models today. You have to do a lot of trying to almost trick the model sometimes to get the output that you want. But the models are getting, especially the frontier models, are getting better and better at actually interpreting what people want. And they're also building more things into the model training to get reliable results, where a lot of the best models in the industry now support accepting a schema to generate an output that conforms to the schema, accepting being able to create structured output. So I don't need to sort of try to trick the model into doing that, where it can do it 99% of the time, but 1 out of 100 it doesn't do it successfully. So I think the models are getting a lot better at interpreting the results and the things that we want. So over time, that process of essentially trying to manipulate the models going to become less of a hindrance for companies. And I think we'll also get to a place where we probably have something that's a little more structured in terms of crafting some of these prompts. You
mentioned this on MCP. IBM's doing some ACP on similar with agent to agent. Mm-hmm. But I guess I know you've written around, or you're spoken around the silo problem with AI agents. Can you take us down that hole a little bit more, break down what's happening technically when these agents fail to communicate across platforms, where we are, where we need to be? Will MCP get us there, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we touched on a little bit of my thoughts on how no one's going to be building sort of a singular monolithic agent. You end up with a multi-agent system. And if you have a bunch of agents that need to work together to solve a problem, then they need to communicate with each other. So that's one problem, is how do I make these things communicate? And then on top of that, if, in a business, it's not like I just want to build one multi-agent system to solve one particular task. Myself and my team might be building agents. You and your team might be building agents. We might be also getting some off-the-shelf agents from Salesforce and Snowflake and various locations. And then all of those have been developed using different technology. How do I get those systems to all talk to each other when they haven't been designed to essentially talk to each other? And that's really this like AI silo problem that I've written about. And then on top of that, we also have another sort of fragmentation integration problem, which is that each of these agents rely on bringing in data or making certain functional calls to tools and various data systems. And if I have, one agent that integrates with 3 different tools or data systems, that's not a big deal. I can develop that any way I want. But if now I have hundreds of agents and they integrate with hundreds or maybe thousands of different systems, that starts to become a problem where I'm going to have a huge integration task on my plate. And there's a lot of code to maintain that's not particularly valuable to most businesses. It's not like core IP. I'm just like stitching together some translation from natural language to an API or something like that. So those are kind of the 2 big like integration problems that exist in building agents at scale today. So Model Context Protocol, which came from Anthropic last year, which was the technology I said I would bet on, was their proposal to solve the tool integration problem. So if we have fragmentation of tools and everybody's building their own tool integrations, it's not great from an ecosystem standpoint. It's not great from a business perspective. So Anthropic proposed a standard where I can, if I have different systems that I want to expose to standard, I can build an MCP server where I essentially a client is able to request what capabilities I have. And it's able to talk through this standard to my MCP server, and I can expose whatever tools and resources I want through that system. And then if the agent system that I'm building on top of essentially supports MCP as a client, talk to whatever MCP server I want to integrate with. So that's focused on solving that problem. And as I mentioned, it's got a lot of traction early through open source, and then all the sort of major players have come out with support for it relatively recently. And then the agent communication, there's a couple of different suggestions there. You mentioned IBM's ACP, which I believe is focused primarily on inter-agent communication. And then there's Google's agent-to-agent protocol, which is focused on sort of cross-platform communication. So I want to make it so my Salesforce agents can talk to the agents I built in my house, in-house. They can also talk to, my Snowflake agents all over one sort of standard. And I think the thought process there is they're trying to, in much the same way that we standardize the web with things like HTTP, so that any client of the web can consume, a server. They're trying to make it so that any agent developed by anyone can communicate with agents with each other. You'll send messages back and forth across the standard. And without that, you end up essentially, if you don't have something like that, you end up with a bunch of islands of agents that don't talk to each other.
Are there any standards we're missing right now that you can see offhand? I mean, now we got MCP, because we got Google's, we got ACP, IBM, agent to agent. We just talked through all those. Anything we're missing?
I think a big area that is still left primarily to teams to kind of figure out is around like testing and eval agents. There's a couple of different companies that are working on that, but there's not really kind of like a generally accepted industry standard for this, or like a reference architecture that everyone's following. From what I see from people who are putting some of these things in production, almost every single one of them is rolling their own version of like testing.
What else did we miss?
I mean, I guess we could talk a little bit about, if we want to, like in terms of these standards, like what, I guess like sort of bigger picture, what does that mean for the industry, and what characteristics of standards tend to win? Because just because you have a standard doesn't mean that it actually is.
That's a great question. Thanks, C. You're the better host.
So I think that there's a big debate right now I see in the industry around these various standards of what does it mean for the industry. Customers are all concerned about it. They all want to learn more, but they don't necessarily know what it means for their businesses. And then on top of that, there's a big question around, is now the right time for standards versus some other time? Like, we're so early, everything's moving so quickly. Is it the right time to standardize? I think that's a hard thing to answer, but I think the compelling thing with some of the standards around MCP, agent to agent, ACP, is that to me, it's a signal of maturing of the market, where in the early days when it's all essentially science experiments, duct tape and chipping wire, and everyone's just doing demos and nothing's hitting production, then there's less of a sense of urgency around creating essentially standards with which you want to enforce so that you can productionize this stuff. Because if it's a science experiment and you're building it, for a demo, it doesn't really matter. But now I think companies are getting to a place where they're moving beyond science experiments and starting to put this stuff in production. And that's when essentially you start to have compelling reasons for having some sort of standardization. I think MCP is solving a current pain point. I think A to A is kind of looking at a future pain point, because I think most businesses aren't to a place where they have thousands of different agents all running that need to talk to each other. If you believe the future is that, we'll get there someday. But I think right now that's not necessarily a problem for businesses. And I think when it comes to adopting some of these technologies, my advice for businesses is that you really have to architect for adaptability. Because even though things like MCP seem to be here to stay, there could be other standards that come along. Not everything's going to have an MCP server right now. So you do end up with multiple integration points. And you have to essentially be designing and building these systems so that they're very adaptable. Because a new model is going to come out next week that you want to be able to test and iterate with. A new type of framework is going to come along as well. So you can't build these things tightly coupled to a particular technology, particular vendor, or you're not going to be able to take advantage of essentially the latest innovations.
But isn't that trepidation going to create some resistance to AI, at least in the short-term implementation for a lot of companies? Because they're like, oh, I don't want to get started and then get aligned to a model, protocol, whatever, and all of a sudden I have to change. So I'm just going to hold out and wait for a bit.
I think that's a little bit like waiting in 1995 for the Pentium chips to stabilize, because basically the industry is never going to stabilize. And if you wait, you're just always going to be behind. You're never going to get out. You're going to be a dinosaur. It's like the companies that were waiting to see, like, is this internet thing going to pan out or not? Like, and then companies came along and sort of owned that market. So you have to get some bets going. You can still build, I think, for adaptability and flexibility, such that you can take advantage of newest innovations without it becoming a completely, burdensome barrier to being able to build and deploy some of this stuff. So I don't think that you can wait. You have to start to put some bets out there, start moving forward would be my advice for companies. And the other thing is that the only way to learn a lot of this technology is to get firsthand experience. Like, there's nobody really with 10,000 hours on any of this stuff, because it's all moving so new and moving so quickly. You have to build up some of that expertise within your company as well, so you understand, what is possible. Where can we? What are the opportunities within our company to leverage some of this technology? And that's really about balancing. What is your ROI to the level of effort, and also what is your risk tolerance for particular workflows that you're solving for.
Fantastic answer, man. You can tell how knowledgeable you are in the business. So I appreciate it. Do you have a contrarian view on AI? If I was forced to say, hey, what's your contrarian view? What would it be?
I think my contrarian view is that, well, there's two, but maybe I'll do this. So I think we're too hyper-focused on open world problems, especially when we talk about agents. So if you look at like the types of stuff that tends to make headlines, tends to make keynotes at famous companies, events and so forth, there are these like really, really general problems of like, hey, I'm just going to go and talk to an agent. The agent has all my API keys for my entire business and is going to go and solve all my problems. And I just don't think it's realistic that we're at a place today where we can actually do that reliably. And the other thing is, I don't think it's realistic that any bank or business of consequence is going to put like something like that into production. And I think it distracts from some of the real value that you can actually get from a business focused on more closed world problems, where you understand more concretely what the business requirements are, what the expectations are around input and output. It's a much more constrained number of, you basically constrain the problem significantly, so you reduce the chance of variance. So it's like, if I'm doing something like insurance claims processing or loan underwriting, or I just have log files, I want to be able to detect when there's an error and use an agent to decide, do I need to wake up an SRE at 2 a.m, or can I solve this myself? Like, those are really effective. If you can solve those in some reasonable way today, those are really, really high ROI for a business, but they're not these super complicated open world problems. I think businesses need to focus more on these kind of closed world systems, automating existing business workflows, and there's tremendous amount of value if they do that. And they're much, much simpler things to actually get into production.
Another good answer. Thank you for that. I got to tell you, like over this weekend, this last weekend, I've got like a disaster at my house where my dishwasher flooded all over the house. So I got people redoing the house, and I had a gentleman in there moving furniture. While he was there, he's asking me what I do. I say I work for IBM. We start talking about AI somehow, and he's very interested. Obviously, everybody's interested in AI. Then he says, I've got two businesses. One is I move furniture, and he's moving it so they can redo my floors, right? And he goes, I got a pest control business, and they're really talking about AI and pest control. And even myself, I'm like thinking, pest control, you just don't even think of this stuff. All right, so pest control, I did some research on it, and there's a lot of things going on around AI and pest control. Well, like it's AI-powered data analysis to predict infestations, it's smart alerts, it's smart traps and monitoring, AI-enabled devices. They can detect, identify, and report pests, image recognition from remote monitoring, on and on. And then the funny thing is, and this is where it gets into what worries me. So we're talking more, and I said, so what are you going to do? How are you going to evolve? And I anticipated him talking about learning AI, but then the conversation went more into, well, I just hope I continue to earn a salary while AI moves on. And he was heading towards more universal income than relearning AI. I thought, man, I just see so many people that aren't making the transition and continuous learning. That does worry me, because I do believe people won't be replaced with AI. I mean, some may, fine, but for the most part, I still believe they won't be replaced with AI. They'll be replaced with people that are working with and know AI.
Yeah.
And this gentleman, by example, gave me coolest dude on the planet, but it was like he wasn't willing to make that transition. I worry about that kind of stuff. What worries you?
Yeah, I think that's a worry of mine as well. And and I've countered that in various roles, even over the last couple of years, where there are people who are very reluctant to like throw themselves into AI and see the value. And I think sometimes you see, a lot of times in my experience anyway, when I've heard people say like that it didn't work for them, it's because they went to ChatGPT and they put in one prompt and they didn't get a result that they wanted, and they're like, oh, like clearly it doesn't work. And I think that you're really doing yourself an injustice if that's sort of the limit of your experience. It's just like anything, any of these big changes that happen in technology. There's these paradigm shifts that happen every decade or so, from mainframes to PCs to the internet to mobile phones. Like if you aren't, continuously learning and figuring out how to use these technologies to do your job better and be more effective, then you're just at risk of essentially being left behind.
Any other worries before we break?
No, I think we covered it all.
Okay, that's awesome. Hey, Sean Falconer, where can folks reach you?
The best place is probably on LinkedIn. If you search my name, it's there's not a lot of us out there, so you can probably find me on there.
You got the best name on the planet. So yeah, I don't know of any other Sean Falconers. I can't believe there's two of you. Is there?
There is another Canadian Sean Falconer spelled exactly the same way that works for AWS.
Wow. Yeah, so there is two of you. So they're going to have to look for the real Sean Falconer, the real story, the real guy. All right, fantastic. And then I know so you've got LinkedIn. I think it was Sean F, as I recall. You got Software Huddle on Substack, and you've got Sean Falconer on Medium.com, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
I got all this. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your expertise, handling the tough questions. And again, I can't thank you enough.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, hit us on almartintalksdata@gmail.com. You know the drill. Rate us. Let us know how we're doing. Until next time, I'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye.